in the cold, merciless walls of the Tower of London, a terrified 19-year-old girl spent her last hours practicing how to die. Catherine Howard, Queen of England, for less than 2 years, rehearsed the act of placing her head upon the executioner's block, determined to meet death with composure instead of the panic that had haunted her imprisonment. But what crime could demand such a horrific fate for someone so young? The answer lies not simply in her alleged infidelity, but in the ruthless political machine of Henry VIII's court, a world where youth, beauty, and innocence were treated as tools to be exploited and discarded. Catherine Howard's downfall stands as one of the most chilling stories of Tudor England, a grim tale that reveals the harsh reality of life under one of history's most volatile monarchs. Born into the powerful Howard family around 1523, Catherine entered a society where women were expected to serve the ambitions of men, their lives treated as expendable in the pursuit of power. Her short reign as Henry's fifth wife ended in charges of treason, brutal interrogations of her associates, and her own execution on a freezing February morning in 1542. This is not merely a tale of royal scandal, but a look into the machinery of Tudor justice, where confessions were forced through agony, the vulnerable were sacrificed for the ambitions of the powerful, and the king's paranoia could transform love into a capital crime. Catherine Howard's tragic end shows us the horrifying ease with which absolute power can erase young lives. By 1540, England was already shaken by religious upheaval and political terror. Henry VIII, now in his late 40s, had broken ties with Rome, destroyed monasteries, and executed 2 wives in his desperate hunt for a male heir. His court had turned into a dangerous maze of rival factions, where survival depended on reading the king's unstable moods and paranoid suspicions. The Howard family, one of England's most ambitious noble houses, saw an opportunity to restore their influence by placing their young kinswoman Catherine in the king's path. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's once powerful chief minister, had engineered the king's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, and enemies of Cromwell sensed weakness. The Howard faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, carefully positioned Catherine as the perfect alternative to the unwanted German princess. They understood Henry's weakness, his hunger for youthful charm, which distracted him from his grotesque appearance and decaying health. By this point, Henry was plagued with obesity, festering leg ulcers, and a foul odor that repulsed those around him. Yet he still longed for a woman who could make him feel powerful and desired. For the Howards, Catherine was the ideal candidate. Young, beautiful, and tied to Catholic sympathies that promised hope to conservatives longing for England's return to the old faith. But what they overlooked was Henry's increasing instability. The king had grown merciless, ready to destroy anyone who threatened his pride or authority. England in 1540 had become a nation of fear, where informants lurked in every corner and private words could be twisted into accusations of treason. The royal court was no longer just a place of politics. It was a gilded prison where courtiers smiled as they plotted each other's downfall, and where the king's affection could transform into a death sentence overnight. Catherine Howard's childhood offered little preparation for the nightmare awaiting her. Orphaned young after her father's death, she was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. In theory, the Duchess's estates at Chesworth House and later Horsham should have provided a noble education and strict moral guidance. Instead, they became breeding grounds for neglect, gossip, and dangerous experimentation. The Dowager Duchess, more absorbed in her own concerns than in properly supervising her wards, allowed young girls to live with little oversight. Catherine shared dormitories with older girls who introduced her to adult relationships and whispered lessons about secret romances. In this environment, she was exposed far too early to the realities of intimacy, deceit, and ambition. Her first serious involvement was with Henry Mannix, her music teacher, a man much older than Catherine, who was still barely a teenager. Their relationship, inappropriate by any measure, was marked by secrecy and manipulation. Mannix taught her not only about physical intimacy, but also how to deceive her guardians and conceal forbidden meetings. It was a pattern that would shadow her life: secrecy, manipulation, and the use of romance as currency. When her involvement with Mannix ended, Catherine soon became entangled with Francis Dereham, a gentleman pensioner in the Duchess's household. This relationship was far more serious, involving promises of marriage, gifts, and the language of husband and wife. Witnesses later testified that they believed a binding betrothal existed between them. The dormitory, where Catherine lived, became a nest of whispered promises and reckless affairs. Her roommates later confirmed the lax atmosphere, describing how meetings were common and how the elderly Duchess chose willful ignorance over discipline. The young Catherine, lacking protection or guidance, was being shaped into the very image that would later be used to destroy her: reckless, promiscuous, and unfit to be queen. These early indiscretions, which in another life might have faded into memory, would resurface as weapons in her downfall. The same youthful mistakes that should have been dismissed as immaturity were transformed into evidence of corruption and deceit. In Henry's England, a queen's past was never truly her own. It could be rewritten as proof of treason. The investigation that eventually condemned Catherine Howard did not begin with her behavior as queen, but with the exposure of her childhood. Court officials traced back her history, revealing the negligence of her guardians and the inappropriate relationships that had marked her adolescence. What was common among many young women of her class became, under royal scrutiny, damning evidence of her character. By 1540, Catherine had caught Henry VIII's attention, but the road to becoming his fifth wife was paved with the wreckage of his earlier marriages. The king's pattern had become frighteningly predictable: infatuation, swift marriage, and then either annulment or execution once his wife failed to deliver the longed-for son or fell from his unstable favor. Henry's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a disaster from the start. From the moment he saw her portrait, he complained of being misled, cruelly mocking her as the Flanders mare. Their marriage was never consummated, and Henry eagerly sought annulment. The Howards, skilled at exploiting royal weakness, seized the opportunity. They had already seen one of their women, Anne Boleyn, rise to queenship and then fall to the executioner's blade. Now they were prepared to risk another. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, orchestrated her entrance into court life with precision. She was appointed as maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, putting her directly within the king's reach. While Henry detested his current marriage, Catherine's youth, beauty, and liveliness provided the perfect contrast to the foreign queen. He was desperate for escape, and Catherine became his obsession. Henry's pursuit of Catherine was both unsettling and pathetic. The desperate efforts of an aging, ailing tyrant to recapture his youth through the conquest of a teenager. Bloated, ulcer-ridden, and increasingly violent, Henry showered Catherine with gifts, jewels, and promises of devotion. She, barely 17 and with little understanding of the storm she was stepping into, became the object of the king's obsessive desire. The Howard family carefully trained her for this role. She was instructed on how to behave with Henry. Flirtatious but not too bold, innocent yet alluring, always mindful of her role as the key to Howard influence. Catherine was less a bride than a pawn, her life mapped out by the ambitions of men who cared little for her fate beyond what power she could deliver. Her rise seemed dazzling, but every step pulled her deeper into a web of danger she could not escape. The same youth and beauty that won her the king's heart would soon place her in mortal peril, and while she played the part of queen, the shadow of her past, the secrets from her teenage years, was already waiting to destroy her. The speed with which Henry shifted from annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves to marrying Catherine Howard shows just how deeply infatuated he had become, and how little reason mattered when he was consumed by desire. Within only weeks of his annulment being finalized, Catherine found herself crowned Queen of England. It was a position that offered immense privilege, but also unimaginable danger. Their wedding took place in July 1540, only weeks after Henry cast aside Anne of Cleves. What should have been a joyous ceremony felt more like a funeral march hidden beneath glitter and pageantry. Catherine, barely 19, stood beside a man nearly 30 years her senior, a man whose track record with wives included both annulments and executions. The Howard family celebrated their restored influence, but Catherine seemed largely unaware of the deadly precedent she was following. At first, her queenship looked like a success. Henry, thrilled by his young wife's charm and liveliness, appeared happier than he had in years. He lavished her with gifts, including jewels once worn by his previous wives, a macabre recycling of tokens that revealed his callousness toward the women he discarded. Catherine embraced her new life with youthful enthusiasm. She delighted in court ceremonies, luxurious gowns, and the visible power her crown gave her. To many, she even seemed compassionate, intervening to help prisoners, including some who had been condemned for religious reasons. For a brief moment, she won admiration at court, but the very qualities that had captured Henry's attention soon left her dangerously exposed. Her youth, naivety, and friendliness made her an easy target for those seeking influence, while her warm personality was often misread as flirtation by ambitious men who saw opportunity in her vulnerability. Henry's health at this point was deteriorating rapidly. His festering leg ulcers gave off a stench that no one could ignore. His body, bloated from years of indulgence, had grown so heavy that he needed mechanical devices to mount a horse. These ailments fed into violent mood swings, making him unpredictable and terrifying. Living as his wife was not simply a privilege, it was a daily gamble with an unstable tyrant. Catherine's failure to conceive quickly only added pressure. Henry's desperate need for a male heir had already cost 2 wives their lives, and whispers at court began to question her fertility. Each month that passed without pregnancy intensified the scrutiny, creating an atmosphere where every word, glance, and action could be twisted into evidence of betrayal. The Queen's household was no sanctuary. Like all royal establishments, it was filled with spies and informants, loyal not to Catherine, but to political factions willing to pay for information. Her private conversations were monitored, her gestures recorded, and her servants acted as agents of surveillance. Every aspect of her life became a stage where any misstep could mean her destruction. The attraction that would ultimately doom Catherine appeared in the form of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Young, handsome, and full of vitality, everything Henry was not. Culpeper embodied the life Catherine had been denied in her marriage to the King. At roughly her age, with charm and easy access to her private chambers, he became irresistible. What began as harmless glances soon grew into dangerous intimacy. Culpeper's position within the king's household gave him regular access, and he used it to draw closer to the Queen. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, widow of George Boleyn, executed alongside Anne Boleyn, became their go-between. Having survived one queen's destruction, she should have known better. Yet she actively facilitated Catherine's secret meetings, sealing her own fate in the process. Catherine's letters to Culpeper, written in her own hand, became the most damning evidence. In them, she confessed her longing and despair, writing lines like, "It makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot always be in your company." Such words, innocent in another context, were treated as treason when spoken by a queen. Their meetings were held in the Queen's private chambers, on royal progresses, and in hidden corners of the court. Coded messages and trusted servants ensured secrecy, but the elaborate precautions only reinforced the appearance of guilt. The romance was reckless, built on passion but blind to the deadly consequences of betraying Henry VIII. Culpeper's motives remain debated. Was he genuinely in love, seeking political advantage, or simply intoxicated by the thrill of the forbidden? Whatever the truth, his actions showed a disregard for the danger of defying the king. For several months, the affair continued with growing boldness. Stolen glances turned into long, private conversations. Brief meetings became passionate encounters, and yet, in their reckless pursuit, both Catherine and Culpeper seemed to forget the fate of Anne Boleyn, executed only years before under similar charges. The walls finally closed in on Catherine in October 1541. Her downfall began not with her actions as queen, but with her past catching up to her. The trigger was John Lascelles, a reformer determined to weaken the Catholic Howard faction. Seizing an opportunity, he exposed Catherine's youthful indiscretions, reporting them to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Lascelles' sister, Mary Hall, had once served in the Dowager Duchess's household and had personally witnessed Catherine's earlier relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. Her testimony became the spark that ignited the Queen's destruction. For Cranmer, the revelation was a nightmare. To accuse the Queen of immorality was to risk Henry's wrath, but to remain silent meant potential treason. After careful thought, Cranmer chose a dangerous compromise. He presented the accusations to the king in the form of a private letter, sparing himself the risk of speaking them aloud. Henry's initial reaction was disbelief. He refused to accept that the young bride who adored him could betray him so completely. His fury first fell upon the messenger. But as more evidence piled up, disbelief hardened into the cold rage that had already sealed the fates of Anne Boleyn and others before her. The investigation that followed was brutal. Francis Dereham and Henry Manox were arrested and tortured until their confessions were torn from them. Under the agony of the rack and other instruments, they provided lurid details of their relationships with Catherine, painting her as willing and promiscuous even in her teenage years. Thomas Culpeper was arrested soon after. His interrogation revealed the depth of his involvement with the Queen. Under torture, he admitted to private meetings but denied consummation, though whether this was truth or a desperate attempt to save himself is impossible to know. Lady Rochford, too, was arrested. Her testimony confirmed the role she played as intermediary, detailing the elaborate schemes to conceal the Queen's romance. Her words made clear that the affair had been premeditated, not accidental. On November the 14th, 1541, Catherine was confined to her apartments. From that moment on, she ceased to be queen and became a prisoner. The young woman who had once sparkled at court was suddenly isolated, stripped of allies, and surrounded only by carefully chosen attendants loyal to the crown. Her imprisonment was calculated to break her spirit. She was denied writing materials, cut off from the outside world, and subjected to relentless interrogations. The psychological torment rivaled physical torture. Witnesses later described her emotional collapse, alternating between hysterical outbursts and eerie silences. She was, in every sense, being destroyed before she even reached the executioner's block. Unable to fully grasp how completely her world had collapsed, the young woman who had once commanded the wealth and influence of a kingdom was now powerless to control even the smallest details of her daily life. The interrogations that followed focused not only on her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, but also on her past, specifically her failure to disclose earlier entanglements before marrying the king. The commissioners pressed relentlessly, eager to determine whether Catherine had ever entered into a binding betrothal with Francis Dereham. If proven, such a contract would render her marriage to Henry invalid, and worse, brand her actions as treason. Catherine's answers were scattered and often contradictory. They reflected not only her emotional collapse, but also her confusion about the legal traps being laid before her. To her, those earlier relationships had been private mistakes. To Henry's government, they became deadly evidence of betrayal. Her youth and limited education made her painfully vulnerable to the sophisticated legal arguments now weaponized against her. She struggled to comprehend how personal experiences, whispered in the shadows of her adolescence, could be reshaped into capital crimes. The Queen's health deteriorated as confinement stretched on. She grew thin, unable to sleep, her hands trembling with a nervous condition her guards carefully documented. In Henry's court, even a woman's physical weakness could be twisted into proof of guilt. But it was already clear her fate was sealed. The king's history with wives accused of unfaithfulness left no doubt about the outcome. The only question was whether she would meet the executioner's axe privately or endure the horror of being burned alive as a traitor before the public. The legal machinery moved with ruthless efficiency. Parliament was summoned to pass a bill of attainder, condemning Catherine without trial. This legislative weapon bypassed English judicial tradition, allowing Henry to destroy his queen without giving her the chance to defend herself. It was a chilling distortion of justice, proof that under Henry's tyranny, law bent entirely to royal will. The charges were drafted with brutal precision. Catherine was accused of concealing her past relationships, committing adultery with Culpeper, and conspiring it to imagine the king's death through her treasonous conduct. Evidence included her own love letters, testimony from servants, and confessions extracted from men under torture. To the Crown, this was not the story of a naive girl, but a carefully framed conspiracy. Culpeper and Francis Derham met their own grim ends. Derham endured the full savagery of traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, a spectacle designed to terrify. Culpeper, perhaps spared because of his higher status or Henry's lingering affection, was granted the mercy of beheading. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, posed a problem. Broken by imprisonment, she had descended into madness. Traditionally, English law forbade the execution of the insane, but Henry's Parliament passed a special statute declaring madness no defense against treason, clearing the way for her death. The Bill of Attainder passed through Parliament swiftly and without resistance. No voice dared to defend Catherine. The silence of the chamber reflected the absolute dominance of Henry's will. Catherine's final days in the Tower revealed both the cruelty of Tudor justice and the unexpected strength of a 19-year-old girl confronting death. Transferred there on February 10, 1542, she was confined in the same rooms where Anne Boleyn had waited 6 years earlier. The symbolism was deliberate, a cruel reminder of the fate awaiting any queen accused of betrayal. Sir John Gage, Lieutenant of the Tower, was ordered to treat Catherine with the respect due to her royal rank, while also ensuring she had no chance of escape or suicide. It created an atmosphere of eerie civility, the polite preparation of a ritualized killing. To the surprise of many, Catherine's behavior in these final days revealed a maturity that had been absent during her brief reign. The frivolous, giggling girl of court life vanished. In her place stood a frightened yet determined young woman who turned to prayer and religious texts to prepare herself for the end. Her most haunting request came when she asked that the executioner's block be brought into her chamber so she could practice laying her head upon it. She rehearsed repeatedly, determined to die with composure and not with the hysteria that had marred other royal deaths. Guards later recalled her calm precision, adjusting her position so that the executioner's stroke would be swift and clean. Denied writing materials, Catherine dictated her last letters to attendants. She expressed remorse for not revealing her past before marriage, but firmly denied ever committing adultery as queen or conspiring against Henry's life. Her words were both a confession of youthful mistakes and a plea for God's mercy. She also made provisions for her loyal servants, asking that they be cared for after her death. A final act of thoughtfulness from a girl whose own future had been destroyed. On the evening of February the 12th, 1542, Catherine was told her execution would take place the next morning. She spent the night in prayer, refusing food, focusing only on spiritual preparation. Witnesses described her composure as extraordinary. Her calmness in those hours a striking contrast to the terror of her situation. At dawn on February the 13th, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold inside the Tower grounds, the very spot where Anne Boleyn had died. The decision to keep the execution private was strategic, reducing the risk of public sympathy for the young queen. The French executioner, chosen for his skill, ensured her death would be swift. A small crowd gathered, Tower officials, courtiers, representatives of the king, and her own attendants. It was a grimly formal affair, the ritual murder of a girl whose only real crime had been immaturity and misjudgment in a court that thrived on suspicion. Catherine walked to the scaffold with surprising steadiness. Those present remarked on her dignity, noting that she seemed transformed in her final moments. Accounts differ on her last words, but most agree she declared herself guilty of failing the king, but prayed for his long life. Whether these words came from sincerity or were carefully chosen to protect her family, they left an impression of humility and courage. She then laid her head upon the block exactly as she had practiced. In a single stroke, the executioner ended her short, tragic life. Catherine Howard, once a carefree teenager thrust into the center of England's most dangerous court, had faced the ultimate penalty for her mistakes. But in death, she reclaimed something she had lost in life: dignity. Dressed in a black velvet gown with a white kerchief, Catherine Howard walked to the scaffold with steady steps, showing no outward signs of fear. Her calm movements, rehearsed countless times, revealed the care she had taken to prepare for this moment. Even those who had come expecting a broken girl were struck by her composure. Her final speech was brief, following the ritual expected of queens condemned to die. She admitted her offenses against the king, asked the crowd for prayers, and forgave those responsible for her downfall. She made no attempt to proclaim innocence or plead for mercy. Catherine knew such words would be useless, and her dignity lay in submission rather than resistance. The French executioner, chosen for his skill, ended her life with a single swift stroke. The young queen died instantly, her suffering brought to an end after months of confinement, questioning, and psychological torment. She was buried immediately in an unmarked grave within the Tower's chapel, beside Anne Boleyn and others who had fallen victim to Henry's paranoia. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was executed shortly after, her death completing the destruction of all who had been entangled in Catherine's scandal. That she was killed, despite her clear madness, demonstrated just how far Henry was willing to go to erase anyone connected to his wife's supposed betrayal. Catherine Howard's execution marked not only the tragic end of a young queen, but also the collapse of her family's influence. The Howard dynasty, once restored to prominence through her marriage, found itself shattered. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was later condemned to death for treason, saved only by Henry's own passing the night before his scheduled execution. By then, the family's repeated involvement in royal intrigue had pushed the king's tolerance to its limits. The brutal efficiency with which Catherine was destroyed and the systematic elimination of those around her revealed the true nature of Henry VIII's rule. This was not justice, but the naked exercise of absolute power, where a wounded king's pride was enough to justify the judicial murder of a 19-year-old girl whose greatest crime was falling in love with someone her own age. The aftermath shook English society. Catherine's rapid fall was a chilling reminder of the dangers faced by anyone who crossed Henry or became trapped in the politics of royal marriage. The speed with which the king cast off his fifth wife sent a warning. Betrayal, real or imagined, would be met with swift, merciless punishment. Parliament, having dutifully passed the Bill of Attainder that condemned Catherine without trial, quickly moved to tighten laws. A new statute declared it treason for any woman to marry the king without first confessing her full sexual history. It was a law born from paranoia, revealing just how fragile Henry's ego had become. The religious impact of Catherine's fall was just as significant. Her Catholic relatives had hoped her influence might restore traditional practices, but her disgrace handed victory to Protestant reformers who had maneuvered skillfully behind the scenes. The Howard family's humiliation became a triumph for England's Protestant cause and reinforced the break with Rome. Henry's reaction was predictably callous. He expressed no regret for ordering his teenage wife's death. Instead, he painted himself as the victim, blaming Catherine for deceit and accusing her family of Catholic conspiracy. His ability to frame himself as the wronged party while executing a 19-year-old girl showed the moral void at the center of his rule. When Henry sought a sixth wife, the lessons of Catherine's tragedy shaped his choice. Catherine Parr was selected carefully, her maturity and Protestant loyalty seen as safeguards against the kind of romantic indiscretions that had doomed her predecessors. Henry demanded exhaustive background checks before allowing the marriage, a grim sign of how Catherine's downfall had deepened his paranoia. The broader message to England was unmistakable. Catherine's fate reinforced the terrifying reality that no one, not even a queen, was safe from the king's wrath. Noble birth and royal marriage offered no protection when the monarch's suspicions turned. An atmosphere of fear gripped the aristocracy, who now lived under constant threat of Henry's unpredictable temper. The historical legacy of Catherine Howard's death has continued to evolve. For centuries, she was dismissed as a frivolous, promiscuous girl whose recklessness sealed her fate. Modern historians, however, see a different picture. Feminist scholarship, in particular, has reframed Catherine as a victim of systemic abuse and exploitation. From her coerced teenage relationships to her manipulation by powerful men, and finally, her destruction at the hands of her husband. This interpretation emphasizes the vast imbalance of power that defined her life. Catherine's early relationships with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham, begun when she was barely a teenager, are now understood as clear exploitation. In modern terms, these encounters would be classed as abuse, not youthful indiscretions. What was once used as evidence of her immorality is now seen as proof of how little agency she had in her own story. The question of her actual guilt with Thomas Culpeper remains unresolved. While her letters to him reveal intimacy, they stop short of proving adultery. Culpeper's confession, made under torture, was shaped more by survival than truth. Did Catherine actually commit adultery, or was her fate sealed by suspicion, politics, and Henry's paranoia? Historians remain divided. What is certain is that her legal condemnation was a travesty of justice. She was denied a trial, condemned by parliamentary decree, and destroyed by evidence built on torture and forced testimony. New laws were even written specifically to ensure her conviction. Catherine's fate was not sealed by fairness, but by the king's desire to protect his pride at any cost. Re-examined today, her story reveals the deep cruelty of Tudor society toward women. Catherine's body and reputation were political commodities, traded, surveilled, and ultimately discarded. Her fate illustrates how young women were systematically controlled, their choices shaped entirely by the ambitions of fathers, uncles, husbands, and kings. Yet despite her youth and vulnerability, Catherine's last days revealed unexpected strength. Her dignity at the scaffold, her quiet courage in facing death, and her refusal to collapse into hysteria gave her a measure of victory. The girl, dismissed as foolish, died with a composure that shamed the king who destroyed her. The fascination with her life endures not only because of its tragedy, but because it reflects timeless questions about power, consent, and justice. Her story warns us of the dangers of unchecked authority, where the innocent can be crushed by forces far beyond their control. Catherine Howard's execution is one of the starkest reminders in history that beauty and youth could elevate a woman to the throne, only to become the very weapons used to destroy her. Her death embodies the corruption of absolute power and the tragic cost paid by those caught in its grip. Her story deserves to be remembered not as a tale of scandal, but as a warning about the fragility of innocence in a world where ambition and tyranny outweigh humanity.